What's up YouTube? So this video is going to be a bit different. Before I do a full review, I'm going to go into a bit of a diversion. I've been told sometimes reviewers talk to the audience as if they already know what a Jackery or honestly any solar power station is, and that can sometimes make the review go over their head. People aren't starting with the basics. So let's talk about what a Jackery even is. And what it is basically everything you would buy separate for a van's off-grid power system, enclosed in an easy-to-use box, minus the solar panel part because that part is sold separately. But before we get too far into that, let's talk about what parts go together to create your basic van power system. To hold your bank of power, you have your battery or batteries. In my case, I have a single 200 amp hour Renogy Agm battery. In my minivan, I also had 200 amp hours, but it was in two separate batteries that were in parallel. Inside of the Jackery power station, there are basically battery cells that are set up in a bank. But those batteries on their own couldn't be directly hooked up to the ports in front of the Jackery. There's some middlemen playing along there. So when talking about the different parts that make up a Jackery power station and how they compare to something you would build for your DIY system, I'm going to say stay super basic. I'm not getting into all the intricacies of how you would build a lithium power bank. And since I'm going to be comparing the two systems I have, which is the Jackery and the system built off my Agm batteries, I think I should take a second to talk about Agm batteries because you need to understand a little bit about that to be able to kind of follow me along in my comparison here. Agm batteries are lead acid batteries. There are different types of lead acid batteries, and sometimes they are thrown all into the same pile. Now, Agm batteries, without getting into too much detail, are basically better designed for solar applications than your basic car battery that you might pick up for cheap off an automotive shelf. But, like other non-lithium counterparts, best practice is not to deplete them past 50%. So, that gets us to how do we compare 200 amp hours of Agm battery to 1000 watts inside the Jackery battery? And the answer is through a bunch of conversions. So we're going to just do a little bit of math. So, you have to understand there's three elements to your basic power system math, and that's going to be amps, volts, and watts. Now, to convert your amp hours to watts, you have to multiply it by the voltage of your system. In a lot of cases, most cases, you have a 12-volt power system, and that's exactly what I have in my van. Now, before I do any more math in this video, if I get anything wrong, and you know more than me, please post that information in the comments. This is just a result of my research, and I'm just trying to give a realistic perspective on a DIY system versus a power station based on what's available to me. So, I have 200 amp hours of battery that I'm going to multiply by the fact I have a 12-volt system. And that would give me 2,400 watt hours that I could use in my house battery bank. But we have to go back to that 50% use rule. So let's say we have about 1,200 watt hours of usable energy. This is only slightly more than the Jackery, which has about 1,002 watts of usable energy. The Jackery also uses lithium-ion battery cells, which among other things makes it tons lighter than my house battery. I can pick up this Jackery all day. I could not move my house battery without help. Now, the fact that the Jackery has lithium inside will factor into our cost comparison later, but for the moment, let's move on to the solar panels. So on my roof, I have a solar array or gathering of panels that add up to 300 watts. I have 3 separate 100 watt rich solar panels in parallel. The panels, of course, collect solar power from the sun and send that power to the battery. Now, often the argument is the combination of batteries and solar panels come out cheaper than the Jackery package. But that's missing some other parts that would actually make your batteries and solar panels work together. The battery can't be directly connected to the solar panels without an important in-between player, the charge controller. Now, the charge controller regulates how much power actually reaches the batteries, among other things. There are generally 2 types of controllers, MPPT and PWM. I'm not going to get into the big MPPT versus PWM argument, but for the sake of this video, just know the 1000 watt Jackery also uses MPPT charging, but this is not universal among all Jackery products. My house system has a 40 amp Renogy Rover MPPT controller. For the sake of comparison, we need to do a little bit of math because the advantage of my house system is it can handle the fact that 300 watts of solar is hooked up to it. But could the Jackery handle the same thing? Well, to do this math, you have to take the amperage of your controller, again multiply it by the voltage of your battery bank, and that will give you the potential solar array size that you could have with that controller. So my 40 amp controller times my 12 volt battery bank equals 480 watts of potential panels, according to the basic formula at least. Which means I could actually grow my array for my 12 volt system by another panel, and it should still fit the specs of the charger. Now for the Jackery, the import for solar is 24 volts at 7.5 amps to 8.33 amps. Without getting into a bunch of complicated math, it can only take about approximately 200 watts of power, which is why they include an adapter with the 1000 watt Jackery that'll allow you to hook to 2 of their Solar Saga panels. While the 1000 is the only Jackery I believe that can handle 2 panels, in this way it's still lacking when I have a comparable house battery that has 3 panels that it can pull from. But we are not done. At this point, all we've filled in the blanks for is getting power into a battery bank. We haven't talked about how you get power out of the battery bank and what kind of money you would need to spend to buy parts to create what is already built into the Jackery. So in this modern time, to not have a USB port would be highly unusual. So normally people want USB ports in their van. They'll want a couple of 12 volt ports for possible 12 volt appliances or accessories. And you definitely want some 110 or AC outlets. The USB ports and the 12 volt ports are all going to be part of your DC output. The 110 is going to be part of your AC output. Marked on the Jackery, but if you're not sure what AC and DC is, they're actually alternating current and direct current, and people always tell people that like they know what the heck it means, but a lot of people don't. But even if you don't know, you can clearly see there's 3 plugs with a little power switch on top of them on the Jackery for 110, and then there's another little section that says DC, which has your 12 volt and your USB ports. Alright, so how do we replicate this in a DIY system? Well, there's a couple of things we can do. We can buy, separate little USB connectors and 12 volt sockets and stuff like that. But before we even get there, there's a couple of other things we need to buy. Because what you're most likely going to hook up your DC elements to is a fuse block. So another thing you're going to have to add to your list to build a DIY system is this fuse block. And depending on which fuse block you buy, you might also want to buy extra fuses, but let's assume the fuse block that we find is going to cover our needs just fine. And on top of that, we're just going to make it easy on ourselves, and we're going to buy a switchboard that already has 12 volt and USB ports and not buy them as separate elements, just for the sake of crunching some numbers. Now for our 110, we're going to need an inverter. And to match the Jackery, you need a 1000 watt pure sine wave inverter. I have a 1000 watt inverter in my house system, and the 1000 watt Jackery has a 1000 watt inverter built into its casing. So in this case, they're pretty equal. The point of breaking down all these elements is so that we can actually have a conversation about if a Jackery with all these things enclosed in a neat little package is a true savings from having to build your own system. We're gonna compare my product, which is what I already have in my van, an alternate product that will match a little bit more with the Jackery in cases where that's relevant, and then the Jackery itself. So our 1000 watt Jackery already has a battery, a charge controller, an inverter, and wiring set up that would cover what we would normally do with a fuse box and DC ports. So, battery comparison. My Renogy Deep Cycle Agm battery, 200 amp hours, of which you get to use about half of that, is $350. Now, to get a Renogy, we're going to stick with Renogy just because we're building things around Renogy. There are alternatives that would have different prices, but a Renogy 100 amp hour, since we can use all of it, that's a little bit closer to the Jackery. Lithium battery is about $900. Battleborns are a little more, and if you do some research, for an all-enclosed battery, not separate cells that you would self-build with, you're going to stay in that range. There's some a little bit cheaper, maybe in the $800 range or high $700 range, but in general, $900 is a good number for a lithium battery. So now we're going to get to the charge controller. In my house system, I have a 40 amp Rover MPT charge controller, which runs about $170. Now, if we're just going to try to match what's in the Jackery, we can actually go with a smaller charge controller because it can only handle 200 watts of power coming into it. So let's cut ourselves down to a 20 amp Rover MPT charge controller, which gets us down to $109. For the inverter, we're going to stick with our 1000 watt Renogy inverter for both, which is about $185. And we're just going to grab a cheap blade fuse block off of Amazon. Let's round it around $15. There's a lot of them on Amazon. That's a pretty decent price. And then we're going to round to about $25 for 12 volt sockets and USB port connections. It can go a little cheaper, a little bit more expensive, but that'll give us just a base place to add to our numbers. Buying an Agm battery saved us a lot of money when compared to the Jackery to have a semi-similar system. So getting an Agm battery and building a system off that will save you a lot of money. Now, if you want to get a lithium battery system and you want to keep it at the same level as the Jackery, which in this case we're going to be charging with less panels, so we've, brought down the price of the charge controller and our inverter and our additional parts to hook up DC we're leaving in the same zone, and that costs a little bit more than the Jackery just for those basic items. And there's also some other things we need to discuss, but just to break down the very basics of the system, we've already spent more money building a lithium system separate from the Jackery, even cutting a bit of corners and really pricing things low in the overview. Now, we haven't added solar panels yet, and this is where the Jackery can feel a bit overpriced, to be honest. The two Jackery 100-watt Solar Saga panels are about $300 a piece, which means to get two of them, you've already spent $600. I have rich solar panels on my roof. Those are only $90 a piece, so you could get two of those for $180, which is significantly cheaper than the Jackery Solar Saga panels. There are also other suitcase panels out there that you could get instead of the Jackery product, but for the sake of this, we're saying our alternative has mountable panels. Now, for my system, I have that extra panel, and I can get 3 panels, rich solar, 100 watts, for the price of one Jackery panel. So that is where it's arguable the Jackery is more than a little bit overpriced. But here's some other things to keep in mind. There are tons of little costs that add up when you're building your own system, such as good wires and tools. Usually you're going to need extra wire. You're either going to build those wires yourself, or you're going to buy them fully made. And you are going to need to do crimp connections to hook up to your fuse block. There's all kinds of like little things, and you probably if you've never done this before, you don't own good tools yet. So you're going to have to invest in at least passable tools to produce a comparable product to the Jackery, and good wire along with it. And that's going to add to the cost of your DIY system. If you already own the tools, you're probably a person already into DIY. But between mistakes you're gonna make hooking up your own system and tools you didn't own before deciding to do a DIY system, you're gonna end up spending a lot more little side money than you expected to. So in that way, the Jackery can be a deal. Now, I kept it pretty basic with these numbers just to match the Jackery, but let's really talk about the advantage of a self-built system. And there's 2 really major ones. It can grow as your power needs grow. If you buy a Jackery 500 and discover you exceed its power capacity, you can't just upgrade the battery part. You have to buy a whole new machine. In a DIY system, you can start with a 500 watt inverter instead of a 1000 watt. And if you need 1000 watts later, you can always upgrade later. You can start with a couple of panels and add more. There's so many ways to adjust a DIY system around changes in your power needs without starting from scratch. You can just change a component. You can take out an old battery and add a bigger battery. You can replace a battery that's failing without having to rebuy everything. And also, that's the second advantage. If something breaks, not just that you want to upgrade because you need more power or want a bigger inverter, but if something actually breaks, you are usually just replacing a component and not the entire system. In fact, you often are not out of an entire system if something breaks. It's just usually a replaceable component. Now, the advantage of the Jackery is there is no wiring, there's no tools to buy, it has a much smaller footprint, like you don't have to figure out where to mount an inverter or like a charge controller or all the little components that are going to be wired together. You don't have to think about any of the mounting. It's all built into an easy to carry box that's going to have a much smaller footprint in most cases. And the biggest advantage is it's portable. It will go where you want to go. It doesn't need to stay attached to the van. Now, the 1000 is on the high end of a little challenging to lug around, but this is why it is nice to also have a Jackery, perhaps a smaller one than the 1000, in addition to a house system. It's a great add-on if you start with one. Let's say you start with the Jackery 240 and later on you build your own system. Well, you still have that 240 that you can throw on a picnic table somewhere when you want to get away from the van, or even take on a walk with you and take like your camera and your camera batteries along. So who is the Jackery perfect for, in my opinion? People with smaller vehicles, because they don't have as much room to be wiring up a house system. So if everything's enclosed in one little box, with the exception of maybe connecting to panels or when it's plugged in to charge, it's going to take up a lot less room than trying to build your own system. Tent campers and weekenders, instead of trying to invest a whole bunch of time in building a system, why not just throw a Jackery or some other power station in your tent? It just makes more sense. And definitely if you're just weekending, like, why make a massive investment in a lithium system when you can just buy a lithium power station where everything's already done? I also think these are for people who are not confident that they are tech savvy. I keep bringing up these people. There are people who they will never process building their own system, or they're not confident about it, or electricity scares them. And definitely, actually, despite the cost of the device, it's much safer for someone not confident with their electric skill to buy this box that's already done and wired by a professional company, as opposed to trying to build stuff on their own. It's also good for people who need a fast solution to off-grid power. Some people aren't building on property where they can stay, and so they need a fast solution that's going to work. And a power station, if they can afford it, is that fast solution. And then people who just want something easy. Like, they just want something easy, and they don't need to justify it by any other means except that. Like, these power stations are great for them. It allows them to enjoy the adventure instead of the math. Some people are really into DIY and like all the options that open up with a DIY system. And the fact is, no solar generator or power box or whatever you want to call them out there is all things to all people. If something like the Jackery has enough ports for you, though, why bother with getting into a lot of complexities you don't care about in the long term? Some people just want to run a fridge and charge their laptop while going on an off-grid adventure. And that is completely possible with something like the Jackery 1000, 500, 300, etc., and also some other brands out there. If this is gonna work for you, there's really nothing wrong with that. And while there are options that open up with a DIY system, you really just have to weigh how important those options are to you in the end game.